This company belongs to me. The words were so unexpected that for a moment, the executive boardroom forgot how to breathe. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 42nd floor of Kensington Global Headquarters in downtown Chicago, casting long golden reflections across the polished walnut table. 12 board members sat around it in tailored suits worth more than most people's monthly rent. At the head of the room sat Richard Whitmore, a self-made millionaire whose confidence often entered a room before he did. It was reviewing quarterly projections when the soft voice interrupted everything. Avery had turned toward the doorway. Standing there was a little black girl no older than 8. Her braided hair was neatly tied with blue ribbons. A faded backpack hung from one shoulder. Her sneakers were worn, but clean. In one hand she held a small envelope. In the other, she clutched a silver bracelet that looked decades old. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a few nervous chuckles spread around the room. Richard leaned back in his leather chair and exchanged amused glances with 2 board members. "I'm sorry," he said, fighting a smile. "Did you just say this company belongs to you?" The girl nodded. Her expression never changed. "My mother told me I should come here if anything ever happened to her." The room erupted into laughter. Some covered their mouths. Others openly shook their heads. One executive removed his glasses and wiped tears from his eyes from laughing so hard. Richard stood slowly and walked toward her. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with amusement, "I guess we've all been wasting our time. Apparently the owner of a multi-billion-dollar corporation has finally arrived." More laughter followed. The little girl didn't laugh. She didn't look embarrassed. She didn't lower her eyes. Instead, she glanced around the room as though searching for someone. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said quietly. "My mom told me to find the board if she couldn't come anymore." Something about the way she said it caused a few smiles to fade. Not because of what she claimed, but because of how calmly she said it. Richard folded his arms. "And your mother's name?" Naomi looked down at the silver bracelet wrapped around her wrist. Her fingers brushed its worn surface. "Olivia Carter." The name landed softly. Most people ignored it. But at the far end of the table, a woman named Sarah Collins suddenly stopped tapping. Her eyes moved from Naomi's face to the bracelet. A strange feeling tightened in her chest. The bracelet looked familiar. Very familiar. Before she could say anything, Richard chuckled again. "Miss Carter," he said, "I think someone has filled your head with fairy tales." Naomi finally looked directly at him. Her eyes were steady. Older somehow than a child's eyes should be. "My mom never lied to me." The confidence in her voice made the room grow slightly quieter. Outside the glass walls, the Chicago skyline shimmered beneath a bright autumn sky. Inside, the laughter slowly faded. Sarah could not stop staring at the bracelet. Deep in the back of her memory, buried beneath years of meetings and reports, a forgotten image began to surface. And for the first time that morning, someone in that boardroom started wondering if the little girl standing at the door might not be there by accident after all. Sarah Collins could no longer focus on the spreadsheet glowing on her monitor. The silver bracelet on Naomi's wrist kept pulling at a memory she could not quite reach. Around here, the boardroom slowly returned to normal. Chairs shifted. Poppers rustled. Someone poured coffee. The interruption was already becoming a joke for most of the executives. Richard Whitmore smiled as he walked back toward his seat. "All right," he said, straightening his suit jacket. "I think we have entertained this long enough." Naomi remained standing near the doorway. She did not move. She did not argue. She simply held the envelope against her chest. The confidence that had seemed unusual moments earlier now appeared almost unsettling. Richard noticed it too. "Where are your parents?" he asked. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "My mother passed away 3 weeks ago." The room grew quieter. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard's smile softened, though only slightly. "I am sorry to hear that." Naomi nodded. Before she died, she told me to come here. She said the board would know what to do. Richard sighed and looked around the table. Children hear many things when adults are trying to comfort them. Naomi's grip tightened around the envelope. My mother was not trying to comfort me. She was trying to prepare me. Something in her voice caused a faint chill to move through the room. Sarah looked again at the bracelet. The silver links were worn with age. Near the clasp was a small engraved symbol. Her breath caught. She had seen that symbol before. Years ago, long before she joined the executive team. Long before Kensington Global became one of the largest corporations in the country. Meanwhile, Richard leaned forward and rested his hands on the conference table. Naomi, this company employs thousands of people. We cannot simply accept extraordinary claims without proof. Naomi nodded as if she expected that answer. Slowly, she lifted the envelope. That is why my mother told me to bring this. Iberia followed the envelope. The room that had been full of laughter only minutes earlier suddenly felt much smaller. Richard motioned toward the table. Then let us see it. Naomi walked forward. Her small sneakers made almost no sound against the polished floor. When she reached the center of the room, she carefully placed the envelope on the table. It looked old. The corners were slightly bent. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 6 words. To the board of Kensington Global. Sarah felt her pulse kicking. Richard stared at the writing. For the first time since Naomi arrived, his smile disappeared completely. The handwriting looked familiar. Disturbingly familiar. Before anyone could speak, Sarah stood from her chair. The sudden movement startled several people. Richard, she said quietly, never taking her eyes off the envelope, before we dismiss her, I think we should open that letter. The room fell silent again. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the Chicago skyline. Inside, Naomi stood perfectly still beside the conference table, her silver bracelet catching a beam of afternoon sunlight. And somewhere deep inside Sarah's memory, a forgotten name finally began rising to the surface. No one objected when Sarah reached for the envelope. The silence itself felt like permission. The executives who had laughed only minutes earlier now watched with growing curiosity. Even Richard Whitmore remained still. Sarah carefully lifted the envelope from the table. The paper felt older than it looked. Its surface was slightly rough beneath her fingertips, as though it had been stored away for years before finally finding its way into this room. Naomi stood quietly beside her. The little girl did not appear nervous. If anything, she seemed relieved. Sarah opened the seal and slowly unfolded the letter inside. The room became so quiet that the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls suddenly seemed loud. Sarah scanned the first few lines. Then she stopped. Her eyes widened. Richard noticed immediately. What is it? He asked. Sarah did not answer right away. Instead, she continued reading. Several moments passed before she finally looked up. Her face had changed. The color had drained from it. This letter, she said softly, was written by Arthur Kensington. A ripple moved through the room. Every board member knew that name. Arthur Kensington was not simply the founder of the company. He was a legend. His vision had transformed a small manufacturing business into a corporation worth billions. His portrait still hung in the lobby downstairs. Richard frowned. That is impossible. Sarah lowered her eyes to the letter again. The signature matches company records. Richard stood and moved closer. Let me see it. Sarah handed him the document. Richard studied the signature himself. The confidence in his expression faded slightly. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elegant. Precise. Familiar. Meanwhile, Naomi quietly touched the silver bracelet on her wrist. Sarah noticed the gesture. Her eyes returned to the bracelet once more. Suddenly the memory that had been hiding in the back of her mind came rushing forward. 20 years earlier, when she was a junior assistant, she had delivered documents to Arthur Kensington's private office. On his desk sat a framed photograph. A young woman stood beside him. Around her wrist was an identical silver bracelet. Sarah felt her heart skip. She remembered asking about it. Arthur had smiled and said only one sentence. "That bracelet belongs to family." The memory hit her so hard she nearly forgot where she was. Richard finished reading the first page. His jaw tightened. "This does not prove anything," he said. "Anyone could have obtained an old signature." Naomi finally spoke. "Keep reading." Her voice was calm. The adults looked at her. Richard hesitated. Then he turned to the second page. As his eyes moved across the words, his expression slowly changed. The amusement was completely gone now. Around the table, executives exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody knew exactly what was written in the letter. But everyone could see its effect. Sarah watched Richard carefully. For the first time since Naomi entered the boardroom, he looked uncertain. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline, dimming the afternoon sunlight. Inside, a shadow seemed to settle over the room as well. Richard lowered the letter and looked directly at Naomi. "Who gave this to you?" he asked quietly. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "My mother." Sarah's pulse quickened. Because at that exact moment, she finally remembered the name of the woman in the photograph. Olivia. The name seemed to linger in the air long after Naomi spoke it. Olivia. Sarah Collins felt a wave of memories she had not revisited in years. Across the table, Richard Whitmore slowly placed the letter down. His eyes narrowed as he studied the little girl standing before him. The boardroom remained silent. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Nobody checked a phone. Even the city beyond the glass walls seemed distant now. "Olivia Carter," Richard repeated. "You expect us to believe that Arthur Kensington personally wrote a letter connected to your mother?" Naomi nodded. "I am not asking anyone to believe me. I am asking you to read what he wrote." The answer was so simple that it caught several executives off guard. Richard folded his arms. "And where exactly has this letter been all these years?" Naomi looked down briefly before answering. "My mother kept it in a locked box. She told me I would understand when I was older. She said if she could not explain everything herself, this letter would." Richard glanced toward Sarah. "You remember this, Olivia?" Sarah hesitated. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. "Not personally," she admitted. "But I remember seeing her photograph in Arthur Kensington's office many years ago." Several board members exchanged confused looks. One elderly director leaned forward. "Arthur never displayed family photographs." Sarah nodded slowly. "That is why I remember it. There was only one." Richard immediately shook his head. "A photograph proves nothing." Yet his voice no longer carried the same confidence it had earlier. Naomi noticed it too. "My mother said some people would not want the truth to come out." The words landed heavily. Richard's jaw tightened. "And who exactly are those people?" Naomi looked around the room. "She never told me names." The answer created an even deeper silence. Nobody liked hearing a mystery described that way. It suggested there was more still hidden beneath the surface. Sarah reached for the letter again. "There is something else." Richard looked at her sharply. "What?" Sarah pointed to a line near the bottom of the second page. "Arthur mentions company archives." Several board members leaned closer. Richard read the sentence again. His expression hardened. The line referenced documents placed into secure storage nearly 2 decades earlier. Documents that could only be accessed through a special authorization process approved by the board. Sarah felt her pulse kicking. She knew those archives existed. Most employees did not even know they were there. Why would Arthur place something like this in secure storage? One director asked quietly. Nobody answered. Naomi remained calm. She simply stood beside the table, her silver bracelet reflecting the muted afternoon light. Richard looked at her again. For the first time he seemed uncertain whether he was speaking to a child with an impossible story or a child carrying a secret larger than anyone in the room realized. Outside, dark clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows over the city. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. The laughter was gone. The assumptions were gone. In their place was something far more powerful. Doubt. And as Richard stared at the final lines of Arthur Kensington's letter, a troubling thought began to form in the back of his mind. If the archives contained what the founder claimed they contained, then this meeting was about to become far more important than anyone had imagined. The meeting should have ended hours ago, yet nobody seemed willing to leave their seat. The weight of Arthur Kensington's letter hung over the boardroom like a storm cloud waiting to break. Richard Whitmore stared through the glass walls at the Chicago skyline while executives quietly whispered among themselves. Finally, he turned back toward the table. If those archives exist, then we verify the contents today. Sarah Collins immediately nodded. The authorization process requires 3 board signatures. Richard looked around the room. For the first time, nobody objected. Within minutes, signatures were entered into the secure company system. The request disappeared into a network that had not been accessed in nearly 20 years. Naomi watched silently. Her small hands rested on the straps of her backpack. She looked exhausted now. The confidence remained, but beneath it Sarah could see something else. Ope. Fragile Ope. A few minutes later, an alert appeared on the large conference screen. Archive retrieval authorized. Several executives exchanged nervous glances. Richard's eyes narrowed. Bring everything connected to Arthur Kensington's private records. A member of the legal team left immediately. As the elevator doors closed behind him, an uneasy stillness settled over the room. Nobody seemed interested in discussing quarterly profits anymore. One director removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. If this turns out to be authentic, he said quietly, it could change everything. Richard said nothing. He simply watched Naomi. The little girl noticed. My mother told me people would be afraid of the truth. Richard folded his arms. Truth does not frighten me. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Then why do you keep looking worried? The question landed harder than anyone expected. A few executives glanced away to hide uncomfortable expressions. Richard opened his mouth to respond but stopped. For several seconds he could not find the words. Sarah almost smiled. The child had not challenged him with anger. She had challenged him with honesty. Nearly 40 minutes later, the conference room doors opened. The legal representative returned carrying 2 sealed storage boxes. Dust coated the edges. The sight alone sent a ripple through the room. Those boxes had not seen daylight in decades. Everyone stood as they were placed carefully on the table. A dated security seal stretched across the first lid. Arthur Kensington Private Archive. Restricted access. Richard slowly reached forward and examined the label. The date printed beneath it made his stomach tighten. It matched the year mentioned in the letter. Sarah felt her pulse quicken again. Naomi simply stared at the boxes. Her eyes looked strangely familiar now. Not because she resembled Arthur Kensington physically, but because she carried the same calm certainty described in stories about the founder himself. Richard finally broke the silence. Open them. The seal was carefully removed. The first lid lifted. Inside were folders, photographs, handwritten notes, and several smaller envelopes arranged with meticulous care. At the very top sat a single file marked with bold black letters. The entire room leaned forward. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Richard reached for the file. Then he froze. Because written directly beneath the title was a name nobody in the room expected to see. Olivia Carter. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The file sat in the center of the conference table like a forgotten secret finally demanding to be seen. Richard Whitmore stared at the name printed across the folder. Olivia Carter. The same name Naomi had spoken. The same name written in Arthur Kensington's letter. The same name Sarah Collins remembered from a photograph buried deep in her memory. Slowly, Richard opened the file. The first document inside was a handwritten note. The paper had yellowed with age, but the writing remained clear. Arthur Kensington's signature appeared at the bottom once again. Sarah leaned closer. Several board members stood from their chairs without realizing it. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. Richard began reading silently. With every line, the tension in his face grew. Finally, one director could not wait any longer. What does it say? Richard lowered the paper but did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward Naomi. The little girl stood quietly beside the table, her silver bracelet resting against her wrist. She looked nervous now. Not frightened. Just uncertain. As though she had spent years carrying a story she did not fully understand herself. Sarah gently reached for the document. Richard hesitated before handing it over. As she read, her breath caught. The note described a private trust established by Arthur Kensington many years earlier. It referenced responsibilities, family protections, and instructions regarding future inheritance matters. Most shocking of all was a sentence mentioning Olivia Carter by name. Sarah looked up. Arthur knew her personally. Murmurs spread through the room. Several executives exchanged stunned looks. One elderly director slowly removed his glasses. That alone changes everything. Naomi listened carefully but said nothing. Richard reached deeper into the file. Beneath the note was a photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. The moment he pulled it free, Sarah froze. It was the same photograph she remembered from Arthur's office. A younger Arthur Kensington stood smiling beside a young woman. Around the woman's wrist was a silver bracelet identical to Naomi's. Sarah looked from the photograph to Naomi. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. Not because they looked exactly alike, but because they shared the same eyes. The same calm expression. The same quiet determination. Richard noticed it too. The realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Naomi slowly stepped closer to the table. "That is my mother," she whispered. Nobody corrected her. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned her certainty. For the first time since she entered the room, every executive seemed willing to consider the possibility that she had been telling the truth all along. Then Richard discovered another item inside the folder. It was a smaller sealed envelope with a handwritten instruction on the front. Open only in the presence of the board. The room fell silent once more. Even the city sounds beyond the glass walls seemed to disappear. Sarah felt her pulse kicking. The directors stared at the envelope. Richard held it carefully in both hands. Whatever answers they had uncovered so far suddenly felt small compared to whatever remained hidden inside. And as Naomi watched the envelope being brought to the center of the table, a feeling she could not explain settled over her heart. Somewhere within those papers, her mother's final secret was waiting. The sealed envelope seemed heavier than paper should have been. Every person in the boardroom watched as Richard Whitmore carefully turned it over in his hands. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Arthur Kensington's. The founder had written only a single instruction, yet it carried the weight of decades. Open only in the presence of the board. No one spoke. The afternoon light had faded behind thick clouds, leaving the room washed in a softer gray glow. Naomi stood near the table, her backpack resting at her feet. Heiress never left the envelope. Richard finally broke the seal. The sound was small, but in the silence it felt enormous. He reached inside and removed several folded pages. The first page was a letter. The second appeared to be a legal document. The third contained a list of names. Sarah Collins leaned forward as Richard began reading. At first his expression revealed nothing. Then his eyes stopped on a particular line. His shoulders stiffened. One of the directors noticed immediately. "What is it?" Richard continued reading. Another long silence followed. Finally he lowered the page. Arthur wrote this 14 months before his death. The room remained still. Sarah extended her hand. Richard hesitated before passing her the letter. As her eyes moved across the page, she felt her heart begin to race. Arthur described concerns about certain decisions being made around him. He wrote about protecting a family connection that very few people knew existed. Most importantly, he documented a plan to preserve inheritance rights until specific conditions were met. Sarah looked up slowly. "This was intentional," she whispered. "He wanted these records hidden." Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. One man shook his head. Why would he hide something this important? Nobody answered. The letter seemed to raise more questions than it solved. Naomi listened quietly. She could feel the adults struggling to understand a story that had begun long before she was born. Richard reached for the second document. This time his hands moved more slowly. The legal paper contained signatures, dates, and witness certifications. Sarah watched his face carefully. The confidence that once defined him was becoming harder to find. "This cannot be right," he said quietly. "What?" asked one of the directors. Richard swallowed. According to this document, Arthur established a protected succession clause. The words immediately captured everyone's attention. Corporate succession rules were among the most powerful legal mechanisms inside the company. They determined who could inherit certain rights connected to the founder's estate. Sarah took the paper and reviewed it herself. Within seconds, her eyes widened. "It is authentic." A murmur spread around the room. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. She did not fully understand the legal language, but she understood one thing. The adults no longer looked at her the way they had earlier. The laughter was gone. The doubt was fading. Then Sarah turned to the final page. The list of names. Most belonged to lawyers, trustees, and witnesses from years ago, but near the bottom was a name that caused her breath to catch. Olivia Carter. Directly beneath it was another line. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah read the final words aloud. Future beneficiary to be confirmed through documented lineage. Silence followed. Deep, complete silence. Then every eye in the boardroom slowly turned toward Naomi. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Naomi could feel every pair of eyes in the room resting on her, yet she had never felt smaller. She had come here carrying a letter and a promise. Now she stood at the center of a mystery that seemed to stretch back decades. Sarah Collins slowly lowered the document. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the realization that the story they were uncovering was no longer theoretical. It had a face. It had a name. It was standing only a few feet away. One of the directors cleared his throat. Documented lineage, he repeated quietly. That means Arthur expected evidence to exist. Sarah nodded. Which means he planned for this possibility. Richard Whitmore stared at the papers spread across the conference table. Every new document seemed to remove another layer of certainty. For years he had believed the company's history was fully understood. Now hidden chapters were appearing one after another. There has to be more, he said. Arthur would never leave something this important unfinished. Sarah agreed. She began carefully examining the remaining contents of the archive box. Several folders contained financial records. Others contained correspondence. Then she found a slim notebook bound in dark blue leather. A small handwritten label appeared on the cover. Personal notice. Arthur Kensington. The room immediately grew attentive again. Sarah opened the notebook carefully. The pages contained dated entries written over many years. Most discussed company matters. Some described charitable projects. Others mentioned private concerns. Then she reached an entry dated nearly 21 years earlier. Heiress widened. I found something. Everyone leaned closer. Sarah began reading aloud. Arthur wrote about a disagreement that had taken place within his inner circle. He expressed concern that certain individuals believed inheritance should follow reputation rather than truth. He warned that personal bias could eventually threaten the wishes of the family itself. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Sarah continued reading. The next passage answered the question. Arthur described his determination to protect Olivia Carter from unfair treatment because of assumptions others might make about her future. The room became completely still. Naomi listened carefully. She had never heard these words before. Yet hearing her mother's name spoken by Arthur Kensington somehow felt familiar. As if two pieces of her life were finally beginning to connect. Sarah turned another page. There she found a photograph tucked between the sheets. It slipped free and landed softly on the table. Richard picked it up first. His expression changed instantly. The photograph showed Arthur standing beside Olivia many years earlier. They were smiling. Between them sat a little wooden box. On the lid was the same family crest engraved on Naomi's bracelet. Sarah felt a chill move through her. That bracelet was never just jewelry, she whispered. Naomi instinctively touched her wrist. Her mother had always told her never to lose it. Never to sell it. Never to leave it behind. She had never explained why. Now, for the first time, Naomi thought she understood. The bracelet was not simply a keepsake. It was a connection. A piece of a story someone had tried very hard to preserve. And as Sarah turned to the next notebook entry, a single sentence immediately caught her attention. It was underlined twice in Arthur's handwriting. If anything happens to me, the truth must eventually find her. The words seemed to echo through the boardroom long after Sarah finished reading them. If anything happens to me, the truth must eventually find her. Nobody spoke. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping softly against the tall windows overlooking Chicago. The city lights below flickered on one by one as afternoon slowly surrendered to evening. Naomi stood motionless beside the conference table. For the first time since arriving, she felt overwhelmed. Every document they uncovered seemed to bring her closer to answers, yet also farther from the life she thought she understood. Sarah gently closed the notebook. Arthur knew exactly what he was doing, she said quietly. He was creating a trail. Richard Whitmore remained staring at the final page. His mind kept returning to the same question. Why had Arthur gone to such extraordinary lengths? One of the directors leaned back in his chair. If he intended the truth to be discovered, then he must have left. Final proof somewhere. Several heads nodded. The statement felt obvious. Arthur Kensington had been meticulous. It would never build a path without leading it to a destination. Sarah began sorting through the remaining folders. Most contained financial records, correspondence, and legal reviews. Then she found a sealed packet attached to the back of the archive box itself. It had been hidden beneath a false cardboard panel. Wait, she whispered. Every person at the table immediately turned toward her. Carefully, she removed the packet. A tack label covered the front. Final verification materials. Richard's pulse quickened. Naomi felt her heart pounding inside her chest. Sarah opened the packet and removed several documents. The first contained trust records. The second contained notarized statements. The third was a certified family registry prepared by an estate law firm nearly 20 years earlier. As Sarah reviewed the pages, her eyes widened. These records trace everything. Richard stepped beside her. Together they examined the documents. That is matched. Name is matched. Signatures matched. Each piece connected seamlessly to the materials already discovered. What had once seemed impossible was beginning to look remarkably consistent. Yet something was still missing. Richard noticed it immediately. There is no final confirmation. Sarah nodded. Not yet. Naomi listened carefully. The adults spoke in legal language she barely understood, but she could sense their growing certainty. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was dismissing her. The room had transformed completely. Then an elderly director who had remained mostly silent throughout the day slowly stood. His name was Harold Bennett. He had served on the board longer than anyone else. I remember Olivia, he said quietly. Avery had turned toward him. Sarah looked stunned. You knew her? Harold nodded. Only briefly. Arthur introduced her years ago. The room fell silent once more. Harold stared toward the rain streaking the windows. He spoke about her differently than anyone else. Not as an employee. Not as an acquaintance. As family. The word settled over the room like a bell. Family. Naomi felt. Tears threatened to form, but she blinked them away. Her mother had spent years protecting a secret she never fully explained. Now strangers were uncovering it piece by piece. Harold slowly reached into the archive box and removed one final envelope. Unlike the others, it carried a red seal. His expression changed the moment he saw it. I have not seen this in 20 years, he whispered. Across the front were 7 words written in Arthur Kensington's unmistakable handwriting. Open only when she finally arrives. No one reached for the envelope at first. The 7 handwritten words across the front seemed almost impossible to ignore. Open only when she finally arrives. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls of the boardroom, turning the lights of Chicago into blurred streaks of gold and white. Naomi stared at the envelope as though it were speaking directly to her. She had spent years wondering why her mother protected certain memories so carefully. Now it felt as if every answer had been waiting inside this room long before she was born. Harold Bennett slowly placed the envelope in the center of the table. His expression carried the weight of someone revisiting a promise made decades earlier. Arthur gave this to me himself, he said quietly. The room immediately turned toward him. Richard Whitmore frowned. You never mentioned this. Harold nodded. Because I was instructed not to. The admission sent another wave of surprise through the room. Sarah Collins leaned forward. He trusted you to keep it hidden? Harold looked at Naomi before answering. He trusted me to wait. Silence followed. The envelope no longer looked like a document. It looked like destiny. Richard finally reached for it. His movements were careful now, completely different from the dismissive confidence he had shown earlier that day. The seal cracked softly as he opened it. Inside was a single folded letter and a smaller card attached with a paper clip. Richard unfolded the letter first. The room waited. He began reading silently. Almost immediately, something changed in his face. The directors noticed. Sarah noticed. Naomi noticed. Whatever Arthur had written was affecting him deeply. Read it aloud, Harold said. Richard swallowed before speaking. His voice sounded different. Quieter. More respectful. If you are reading this, then she has arrived. If she stands before you carrying the bracelet and the documents entrusted to Olivia, then the path I created has succeeded. Nobody moved. Richard continued. For many years, I feared that assumptions, appearances, and convenience would be valued more highly than truth. This is why certain records were protected. This is why Olivia agreed to remain silent. This is why the future was placed into the hands of time. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. Naomi listened without blinking. Every sentence felt like a message traveling across decades. Richard reached the next paragraph. His voice slowed even further. The child connected to this letter must never be judged by circumstance. She must only be judged by truth. A heavy silence settled over the room. Earlier that morning, nearly everyone present had done exactly the opposite. Richard himself lowered his eyes. For the first time all day, he seemed unable to look directly at Naomi. Then Sarah noticed the small card attached to the letter. She carefully removed it and turned it over. On the front was a company seal. On the back was a handwritten note. Her breath caught immediately. "Richard," she whispered. "You need to see this." He took the card and read the message. The color drained from his face. Around the table, executives exchanged confused looks. "What does it say?" one director asked. Richard stared at the card for several seconds before finally answering. His voice was barely above a whisper. "It contains the location of the final proof Arthur left behind." And directly beneath the location was a single sentence written in unmistakable handwriting. "The board will know her when they see her." The room remained frozen after Richard read the final sentence. "The board will know her when they see her." Rain continued tapping against the windows, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. Every person around the table was looking at Naomi. Not because Arthur Kensington had told them to, but because something inside them had already begun to change. The little girl standing beside the conference table no longer felt like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong building. She felt like the answer to a question that had been waiting for years. Sarah Collins slowly took the card from Richard's hand and examined the location written beneath Arthur's message. Her eyes widened immediately. "I know where this is." Several directors turned toward her. "Where?" Sarah looked toward the far end of the boardroom. Beyond the glass wall stood a private elevator rarely used by anyone except senior leadership. The Founder Gallery. A murmur spread through the room. The Founder Gallery occupied a secured section of the building that most employees never entered. It contained personal artifacts, journals, awards, and historical records connected to Arthur Kensington himself. Richard frowned. "I thought everything there had already been catalogued." Harold Bennett slowly shook his head. "Not everything." The older man stood and adjusted his jacket. There were rumors for years that Arthur kept one private collection separate from the public archive. Sarah looked at Naomi. "Would you like to come with us?" Naomi nodded immediately. She did not trust her voice enough to answer aloud. Within minutes the board members left the conference room together. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Earlier that morning, Naomi had entered through the front doors alone. Now the entire board seemed unwilling to let her out of their sight. The private elevator carried them downward in silence. Reflections shimmered across the polished steel walls. Naomi held her bracelet gently in one hand. Her mother had always told her that one day she would understand. She wondered if that day had finally arrived. The elevator doors opened onto a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs and company milestones. At the very end stood a locked wooden door bearing Arthur Kensington's initials. Sarah entered a security code. A soft click echoed through the corridor. The door opened slowly. Warm light spilled into the hallway. Inside, the gallery looked more like a personal library than a museum. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Photographs covered the walls. Glass display cases held objects connected to Arthur's life. But it was not the room itself that captured everyone's attention. It was what stood in the center. A single wooden pedestal beneath a spotlight. Resting on top was a sealed box. Harold stopped walking. His expression changed immediately. "My God," he whispered. Sarah looked at him. "You have seen it before?" Harold nodded slowly. "Only once. Arthur placed it there himself." Richard approached the pedestal carefully. Attached to the front of the box was a brass plaque. The engraved words gleamed beneath the soft light. Naomi stepped closer. Her heart pounded harder with every step. Then Sarah read the inscription aloud. "To be opened only when the rightful heir stands before it." Silence swept through the gallery. And for the first time that day, nobody questioned who Arthur might have been talking about. No one moved toward the box for several seconds. The words engraved on the plaque seemed to hold everyone in place. To be opened only when the rightful stands before it. The gallery was silent except for the faint hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of rain against the building. Naomi stared at the wooden box. It was smaller than she expected. Simple. Elegant. Almost ordinary. Yet every document, every letter, every hidden record had led them here. Richard Whitmore slowly stepped back from the pedestal. Earlier that day he would have dismissed the entire situation without hesitation. Now he found himself unable to ignore the growing mountain of evidence surrounding the little girl. Sarah Collins looked from the box to Naomi. "I think Arthur intended for you to open it." Naomi's eyes widened. "Me?" Sarah nodded. "Everything points to you." The board members exchanged glances. None of them objected. Harold Bennett offered a gentle smile. "Go ahead, Naomi." Her small footsteps echoed softly across the gallery floor as she approached the pedestal. The silver bracelet rested against her wrist, catching the warm light from above. For a brief moment she remembered her mother fastening it around her arm years earlier. She remembered being told that some things were worth protecting even when you did not yet understand why. Taking a slow breath, Naomi placed her hand on the box. Nothing happened at first. Then Sarah noticed a small engraved symbol on the lid. It matched the crest on Naomi's bracelet exactly. Harold leaned forward. "The bracelet." Naomi looked down. Carefully, she removed the bracelet and placed it against the symbol. A soft click echoed through the room. Several people gasped. The hidden lock released. Nobody spoke. Naomi slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested a single leather folder and a small framed photograph. Her breath caught when she saw it. The photograph showed Arthur Kensington sitting beside Olivia Carter. Both were smiling. Between them stood a much younger Naomi, perhaps 3 years old, holding Arthur's hand. Tears filled Naomi's eyes instantly. She had never seen the picture before. Around her, the board members stood frozen in disbelief. Richard felt the color drain from his face. The photograph alone shattered any remaining doubts. Arthur had known Naomi personally. Sarah carefully opened the leather folder. Inside was a notarized declaration bearing multiple signatures, legal certifications, trust documents, and a final statement from Arthur himself. Her hands trembled as she read. "This is it," she whispered. Richard stepped closer. "What does it say?" Sarah looked up slowly. Emotion filled her voice. Arthur Kensington formally recognized Olivia Carter as family and established protected succession rights for her direct descendant. Silence swept through the gallery. Sarah continued reading. Upon verification of lineage and presentation of the protected family artifacts, all beneficiary rights shall transfer accordingly. Richard stared at the page. Every document they had uncovered pointed to the same conclusion. Every hidden record confirmed it. Every safeguard Arthur created had survived the passage of time. Naomi looked down at the photograph still resting in her hands. Then Sarah read the final line aloud. "The rightful heir shall be known not by wealth, status, or appearance, but by truth." And at that moment, every member of the board understood that the search was over. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The gallery seemed suspended in time as the final words settled over everyone present. Naomi stood beneath the warm light, holding the photograph close to her chest. The image of her mother smiling beside Arthur Kensington felt more valuable than any document resting inside the leather folder. It was proof of something she had secretly hoped her entire life. Her mother had been telling the truth. Sarah Collins wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before looking toward the board members. One by one, they nodded. Years of uncertainty had finally reached their conclusion. Every letter, every archive, every hidden record had pointed to the same destination. Richard Whitmore remained silent longer than anyone else. Earlier that day he had laughed. He had doubted. He had assumed he already knew the entire story before hearing a single page of it. Now he looked at Naomi with a completely different expression. Slowly, he stepped forward. The room watched carefully. Naomi lifted her eyes toward him. Richard took a breath. Naomi, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. The words carried more weight than any speech he had ever delivered in a boardroom. I judged you before I knew you. He looked at appearances instead of facts. He was wrong. The gallery remained silent. Naomi studied him for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. There was no anger in her face. No triumph. Only understanding. The response seemed to affect Richard even more than the evidence itself. Harold Bennett smiled gently. Arthur would have appreciated that. Sarah carefully returned the documents to the folder. The legal team will complete the formal process, she said. But the truth has already been established. Several directors quietly agreed. Their attention soon returned to Naomi. Yet none of them spoke about money. None of them spoke about ownership percentages or future wealth. Somehow those things felt less important now. Naomi looked down at the photograph once more. My mother never talked about inheritance, she said softly. She only told me that family mattered. The simplicity of the statement filled the room with emotion. Arthur Kensington. I'd spent years protecting records and creating safeguards, but the lesson Olivia passed to her daughter had been even more important. Naomi slipped the photograph into her backpack and carefully fastened the silver bracelet around her wrist again. The familiar weight felt different now. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just understood. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Through the gallery windows, the clouds began to separate, allowing the last golden light of evening to spill across the city. The reflection touched the glass cases, the old photographs, and finally the silver bracelet resting on Naomi's wrist. Sarah noticed it first. The family crest gleamed beneath the sunlight exactly as it had in the photograph taken years ago. A circle completed. A promise fulfilled. As the board members stood together in quiet reflection, nobody saw a little girl who had wandered into the wrong place. They saw someone who carried truth through doubt, dignity through judgment, and kindness through every obstacle placed in her path. And in that moment, the greatest legacy Arthur Kensington left behind was not a company, a fortune, or a name. It was the courage of a child who arrived with nothing more than a bracelet, a letter, and the truth.